April 28th, 1945. A dirt road outside Regensburg, Bavaria. The air smells of diesel and wet earth. An American lieutenant watches through binoculars as a column approaches from the east, not attacking but walking. Hands raised, white fabric tied to rifle barrels. At the front, a German officer in a mud-stained uniform. He stops 10 meters from the American line. His voice is steady, rehearsed. "We wish to surrender," he says in careful English. The lieutenant nods, lowers his weapon. Then the German adds something else. "But only to General Patton's army, not the others." The lieutenant blinks. Behind him, a captain overhears and mutters into the radio, "Sir, the Germans are surrendering to you." By March 1945, Nazi Germany was dying. The Reich that had conquered most of Europe now bled from every border. Soviet armies had crossed the Oder River, less than 50 miles from Berlin. In the west, American, British, and Canadian forces stood along the Rhine, poised for the final thrust into the German heartland. The Luftwaffe was grounded by fuel shortages. The Wehrmacht's divisions existed mostly on paper, filled with teenagers, old men, and foreign conscripts who spoke little German. Adolf Hitler, entombed in his Berlin bunker, issued orders to armies that no longer existed. The war was over in all but name. Everyone knew it. The question was no longer if Germany would fall, but how and to whom. The Rhine crossings in late March shattered the last natural barrier protecting Germany's core. Operation Plunder, the British-Canadian assault north of the Ruhr, overwhelmed German defenses with sheer firepower. Further south, American forces crossed at Remagen after capturing the Ludendorff Bridge intact, a miracle that sent shockwaves through German command. And then there was Patton. On the night of March 22nd, his Third Army crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim without airborne support, without massive preliminary bombardment, with barely any resistance. By dawn, Patton's tanks were 6 miles deep into German territory. He called General Omar Bradley that morning. "Brad," he said, his voice crackling over the field telephone, "don't tell anyone, but I'm across." The crossing was so swift, so surgical, that German forces barely had time to react. The Wehrmacht was no longer a cohesive fighting force. It was a patchwork of exhausted divisions, each commanded by officers who faced an impossible calculus. Fight and die for a regime that had already lost? Surrender to the Soviets, whose reputation for vengeance was well known? Or surrender to the Western Allies, and hope for something resembling humane treatment? German soldiers had heard the stories. They knew what happened in the East. Entire divisions captured by the Red Army simply vanished. The names Stalingrad, Kursk, Warsaw whispered through the ranks like curses. Soviet revenge was not a possibility, it was a certainty. And then there was Patton. Even among the Allied commanders, he was an anomaly. While Eisenhower planned with caution and Montgomery orchestrated with precision, Patton attacked with a fury that seemed almost personal. His Third Army had torn through France in the summer of 1944, racing across the country so fast that supply lines couldn't keep up. He relieved Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge by wheeling his entire army 90 degrees north in 48 hours, a maneuver military analysts still study for its audacity. He didn't just defeat German forces, he humiliated them. His tanks moved faster than German intelligence could track. His infantry appeared where they shouldn't be, when they couldn't be. To the Germans, Patton wasn't just a general, he was a force of nature.
But it wasn't just speed that built his legend. It was theater. Patton wore ivory-handled revolvers on his hips. He delivered speeches to his men that mixed profanity with poetry. He slapped shell-shocked soldiers and faced public disgrace, only to return more aggressive than before. German military intelligence files on Patton were thick with analysis, speculation, psychological profiles. They knew his tactics, they knew his temper, and they knew something else, something the reports stated in careful, clinical language. Patton's forces do not massacre prisoners. That single fact, verified through intelligence networks and escaped POWs, became a lifeline for German soldiers facing the endgame. By April, the contrast was stark. In the east, the Red Army advanced with a vengeance born of 20 million Soviet dead. German soldiers captured on the Eastern Front faced forced labor camps in Siberia, execution for SS membership, or simply disappearance into the vast Soviet prison system. In the West, the situation was different. The Americans, British, and Canadians followed the Geneva Conventions. Mostly, POWs received food, medical care, processing through established channels. They would survive. For Wehrmacht soldiers trapped between two fronts, the choice was obvious. Run west, find the Americans, and if possible, find Patton. The Third Army's reputation spread through whispered conversations in German trenches, through coded messages between retreating units, through the desperate calculations of officers who still held fragments of command. Patton's name became synonymous not with safety. He was still the man who would kill you in battle, but with something more valuable: predictability. His army fought hard, but fought by rules. Surrender meant captivity, not execution. For men who had seen their nation collapse in a barbarism, that distinction meant everything. The word passed quietly through the disintegrating German lines: if you must surrender, surrender to Patton. Patton cultivated his image like a weapon. The polished helmet, the profane speeches, the claim that he believed in reincarnation and had fought in ancient battles. Some of it was genuine: his love of military history, his aggressive instincts, his contempt for caution. But much of it was performance. He understood that war was as much psychological as physical. If the enemy feared you before the battle began, half the work was done. German propaganda had tried to use Patton against the Allies, portraying him as a bloodthirsty cowboy, reckless and undisciplined. It backfired. To German soldiers, bloodthirsty meant dangerous in battle, not murderous in captivity. Reckless meant unpredictable, fast, impossible to trap. The propaganda meant to diminish him, instead amplified his mystique. By spring 1945, Patton existed in two forms: the actual general directing mechanized warfare across southern Germany, and the myth, a ghost that moved faster than reports, struck harder than expected, and somehow represented the least terrible option in a collapsing world. The Abwehr and later the fragmented German intelligence apparatus maintained detailed files on Allied commanders. Patton's dossier was extraordinary. It tracked his movements, his tactics, his personality quirks. One report from late 1944 noted his tendency to visit frontline units personally, often within artillery range, a habit that made him both inspirational to his troops and identifiable to German observers. Another analysis studied his operational patterns: rapid exploitation of breakthroughs, aggressive pursuit, minimal consolidation. The conclusion was grim. Once Patton's armor penetrates, withdrawal is the only option. But the reports also noted something else. Third Army's treatment of prisoners followed protocol. Medical care was provided. Food distributions, though meager, occurred. Executions of surrendered troops were rare and investigated. For German officers reading these intelligence summaries in the war's final months, the subtext was clear: Patton would destroy you in combat, but he would not murder you afterward. The Eastern Front had become a nightmare that defied description. The Red Army's advance into Germany in early 1945 was accompanied by an orgy of revenge. Entire towns were razed. German civilians fled westward with whatever they could carry, clogging roads and slowing military withdrawals. Soviet troops, many of whom had seen their own villages burned and families killed, showed little mercy. For Wehrmacht soldiers, capture by the Soviets meant an uncertain fate at best. The lucky ones spent years in labor camps. The unlucky ones never made it that far. German military radio traffic in April 1945, intercepted and decoded by Allied intelligence, revealed a pattern. Units were abandoning defensive positions in the east, retreating westward despite orders to hold. Some commanders fabricated reasons: tactical withdrawals, regrouping maneuvers. The real reason appeared in the fragments of personal communications. Better the Americans than the Russians. It wasn't strategy. It was survival instinct. In the weeks following Germany's surrender, Allied intelligence officers conducted thousands of interviews with captured Wehrmacht personnel. The testimonies revealed a consistent pattern. A Panzer Brigade commander captured near Nuremberg explained his decision in flat, exhausted terms: "We knew Patton's reputation. Fast, aggressive, but professional. We heard from other units that his men didn't shoot prisoners." The choice was simple. Another officer, a colonel who had fought on both fronts, was more direct. "I told my men, we march west. We surrender to the Americans. Specifically, Patton's Third Army if possible. Not because we admired him, but because we wanted to live." Some testimonies mentioned specific incidents that shaped perceptions. A lieutenant described hearing about a Third Army unit that had provided medical treatment to wounded German prisoners before treating their own lightly wounded, a story that spread through German lines like wildfire. Whether the story was true or embellished didn't matter. It became part of the legend, and legends dictated decisions when nothing else remained. Patton's personal views on Germans were harsh. He despised Nazism and made no secret of his contempt for the SS. But he was also a professional soldier who understood the rules of war. Third Army maintained processing camps that, while Spartan, followed Geneva Convention standards. Prisoners were searched, registered, given basic rations, and transported to rear area camps. Medical personnel treated wounded captives. The system wasn't perfect. No POW system in wartime is, but it was functional and critically predictable. Word of this treatment filtered back through various channels. German soldiers who escaped from captivity carried stories. Resistance networks passed information. Even Nazi propaganda, attempting to portray American brutality, inadvertently confirmed that captured soldiers were alive to be interviewed. 4 Wehrmacht troops facing the end, alive in captivity, was infinitely better than dead in a last stand or vanished into Soviet camps. Patton's army offered something increasingly rare in 1945, a future beyond the next battle. Patton understood that momentum was a weapon. His operational philosophy centered on relentless forward movement. Keep the enemy off balance. Never let them regroup. Attack their psychology as much as their positions. This approach had a dual effect. In battle, it demoralized German defenders who couldn't establish coherent defensive lines. After battle, it created a sense of inevitability. Third Army wasn't just advancing. It was everywhere, moving faster than seemed possible, appearing in unexpected places, overwhelming local commanders before they could coordinate responses. 4 German units in April 1945, this created a peculiar psychological dynamic. Fighting Patton felt futile. His forces would simply go around strong points, cut supply lines, and continue east. But surrendering to him felt, if not safe, at least survivable. The speed that made him terrifying in combat became, paradoxically, an argument for capitulation. Why die slowly in a siege when Patton's tanks would arrive tomorrow, anyway? The question answered itself. Late April 1945, the Third Army drives deep into Bavaria and across the Danube. Behind the advancing American columns, the infrastructure of German resistance simply dissolves. Entire battalions emerge from forests with white flags fashioned from bedsheets and torn shirts. Some units maintain formation, marching in organized columns toward American positions as if on parade. Others arrive in chaos. Soldiers mixed with civilian refugees, horse-drawn wagons beside captured vehicles, officers who have lost all authority walking alongside privates who stopped obeying orders days ago. But the pattern that emerges astonishes Third Army's forward commanders. German soldiers are actively choosing which units to surrender to. On April 23rd, near Neumarkt, a battalion commander reports a bizarre incident to division headquarters. A German major approaches under a white flag and asks, in reasonable English, which American army his unit is facing. When told, Third Army, General Patton, the major nods with visible relief, returns to his lines, and within an hour, 847 soldiers march into captivity. The battalion commander radios back. They asked for us specifically, refused to surrender to a French unit 5 kilometers south. Said they wanted Patton's army. Similar reports flood in from other sectors. Near Regensburg, a Wehrmacht captain leads his company past British positions to reach American lines. Near Passau, SS officers, normally fanatical in their resistance, negotiate surrender terms specifically requesting transfer to Third Army custody. The numbers become staggering. On April 29th alone, Third Army processes over 25,000 prisoners. The next day, 30,000 more. The POW cages, hastily constructed fields surrounded by barbed wire, overflow with captured soldiers. Military police units, designed to handle hundreds, now manage thousands. Some German officers maintained discipline even in captivity, organizing their men into work details, establishing sanitation protocols, attempting to preserve some fragment of military order in the chaos of defeat. American guards watch in bewilderment as German soldiers police their own compounds, salute their captured officers, and wait patiently for processing that, given the numbers, might take days. Patton himself tours the POW enclosures on April 30th. He walks through the wire corridors in his immaculate uniform, pearl-handled revolvers on his hips, face expressionless. German soldiers watch him pass, this man whose name had defined their final weeks of war. Some stand at attention instinctively. Others simply stare. Patton says nothing to them, but later that evening, he writes in his diary, "The Germans are surrendering so fast we can barely keep up." They seem almost relieved. I suppose even dying for a lost cause gets exhausting. His tone is matter-of-fact, but his staff officers note something else. The general who had spent 4 years trying to kill as many Germans as possible now faced the logistical nightmare of keeping them alive. And somehow, absurdly, his reputation was causing the enemy to seek him out for capture. May 1945, the final week of the war in Europe. The Third Army drives into Czechoslovakia and Austria, pushing toward a potential link-up with Soviet forces. Behind them, the map of surrender becomes clearer. Wehrmacht units in the path of the Red Army fight desperate rearguard actions, not to win, but to buy time for retreating columns to reach American lines. German commanders make calculations that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. They abandon defensible positions, ignore direct orders from Berlin, and lead their men west in forced marches that cover 30, 40 miles a day. The goal is singular: reach Patton before the Soviets arrive. On May 4th, near Linz, Austria, an extraordinary scene unfolds. An entire German division, 12,000 men, complete with vehicles, artillery, and administrative staff, approaches Third Army positions in organized formation. The divisional commander, a general named Theodor Tollsdorf, requests a formal surrender ceremony. He and his staff officers are armed. His troops maintain unit cohesion. American officers approach cautiously, unsure if this is surrender or some elaborate trap. Tollsdorf makes his position clear. "We are surrendering to the United States Third Army under General Patton. We will not surrender to Soviet forces. If this is unacceptable, we will continue fighting westward until it is." The American colonel in charge radios for instructions. The response comes from Corps headquarters: accept the surrender. By evening, 12,000 German soldiers are in captivity, and Tollsdorf's division ceases to exist, not destroyed in battle, but dissolved by choice. Similar incidents cascade across the shrinking German territory. Near Pilsen, in Czechoslovakia, Third Army reconnaissance units encounter German columns retreating westward while still engaging Soviet forces to their east. They are fighting a two-directional war, holding off the Russians while seeking the Americans. Some units send officers ahead under white flags to negotiate surrender points, then conduct fighting withdrawals toward those coordinates. It is warfare as bizarre as it is desperate. American commanders find themselves accepting surrenders from units still technically in combat, while watching those same units fire eastward at pursuing Soviet troops. The numbers become almost incomprehensible. In the first week of May, Third Army captures over 300,000 German soldiers. The POW camps turn into temporary cities, sprawling complexes where captured Germans outnumber their American guards by ratios of 100 to 1. Security becomes theoretical. There's simply too many prisoners to guard effectively. But the security isn't needed. These men have nowhere to go, nothing to fight for, and no desire to return to a Reich that exists now only as a geographic expression. They wait in the wire enclosures, eat American rations, and try to process the fact that they are alive. For many, the realization takes days to settle. They had expected to die in the war's final battles. Instead, they had asked for Patton, and Patton, or rather his army, had given them survival. On May 7th, Germany surrenders unconditionally. The war in Europe ends at 11:01 p.m. on May 8th. Patton receives the news in his headquarters in Regensburg. Around him, staff officers celebrate. Champagne appears from somewhere. Toasts are made to victory, to the fallen, to the end of the nightmare. Patton raises his glass, but says little. His war is over, but the phenomenon that defined its final chapter lingers in the overcrowded POW cages, in the testimonies of captured officers, in the strange arithmetic of surrender. Hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers who chose defeat at his hands over any other fate available to them. May 9th, 1945. The guns are silent. Across Germany and Austria, millions of soldiers on both sides try to comprehend peace. For the Third Army, the immediate problem is logistical. Over 400,000 German prisoners sit in improvised camps across Bavaria, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. They need food, water, medical care, and eventual repatriation. The military government infrastructure designed to handle occupation now faces an unexpected burden, caring for an army that had specifically sought captivity under American authority. Intelligence officers begin systematic interviews with senior German officers. The goal is to understand command structures, identify war criminals, and gather information about remaining Nazi resistance. But the interviews reveal something else, a consistent narrative about why these men had chosen surrender to Patton's forces. A Wehrmacht colonel, formerly a regimental commander, explains with weary pragmatism, "We knew the Americans would treat us according to the conventions. We knew Patton's reputation, hard fighter but honorable. The alternative was the Russians, and that was no alternative at all." Another officer, an artillery brigade commander, is more direct. "I told my men we would march west until we found Patton's Third Army." They all understood why. No one questioned it. The disparity in treatment between Western and Soviet captivity becomes stark as information flows in. German soldiers captured by the Red Army face immediate interrogation, often brutal. SS members are separated and executed or sent to gulags. Regular Wehrmacht soldiers are transported eastward, many to labor camps in Siberia and Central Asia, where they will spend years rebuilding the Soviet infrastructure their army helped destroy. The mortality rate in Soviet captivity will eventually be calculated at nearly 15%, tens of thousands of men who survived the war only to die in captivity. By contrast, German POWs in American camps face processing, documentation, and eventual release. The death rate in Western camps, while not zero, is measured in fractions of percent. Word of this disparity spreads even before the war formally ends. German units that failed to reach American lines, trapped by Soviet advances, faced the consequences of geography. Some officers commit suicide rather than surrender to Russian forces. Others attempt breakouts, leading their men in desperate attempts to reach Western lines even after the ceasefire. Many fail. The Elbe River, where American and Soviet forces met in late April, becomes a hard border. German soldiers on the eastern side plead with American troops to let them cross. Orders from higher command are clear: refuse. They are in the Soviet zone. They must surrender to Soviet authority. American soldiers, many of them young men who have fought across Europe, watch as German soldiers weep, argue, and finally turn eastward to face their fate. In the months following the surrender, Third Army begins the long process of demobilization and occupation duty. The POW camps gradually empty as prisoners are screened, classified, and released or transferred. Some German soldiers return to homes that no longer exist, to cities reduced to rubble, to families scattered across occupied zones. Others remain in custody, awaiting trials for war crimes or cooperation with investigations. The vast majority simply fade back into civilian life, carrying with them the memory of the war's final weeks, the desperate westward flight, the calculation of surrender, the choice to seek out Patton's army specifically. Patton himself struggles with the peace. His diary entries from May and June 1945 reveal a man uncomfortable with occupation, frustrated by political considerations, and already thinking about the next war. this time against the Soviets. He tours displaced persons camps and comments caustically on the conditions. He argues for leniency toward German civilians and faces criticism for it. His famous statement, comparing the Nazi Party to American political parties, triggers outrage and contributes to his relief from 3rd Army Command in October 1945. But even in his troubled final months, the legend persists. Former German soldiers, interviewed by journalists and historians, consistently mention his name. "We surrendered to Patton," they say, as if that explains everything. And in a way, it does. Post-war analyses by military historians attempt to quantify the phenomenon. Exact numbers are impossible, battlefield surrenders are chaotic, documentation incomplete. But estimates suggest that in the war's final 6 weeks, 3rd Army captured between 400,000 and 500,000 German soldiers, roughly 1/5 of all German forces taken prisoner in the Western Theater during that period. Some were simply in 3rd Army's path, surrendering because there was no alternative. But a significant portion, perhaps 30 to 40% based on available testimonies, actively sought out Patton's forces, bypassing other Allied units or retreating westward specifically to reach American lines. The psychological dimension fascinates researchers. Wehrmacht officers, trained in Prussian military tradition, made pragmatic calculations about surrender that prioritized survival and honor over ideology. Patton represented both. His aggression in combat earned respect. He was a warrior, not a butcher. His adherence to military convention offered predictability in chaos. The choice to surrender to him became, in the minds of desperate men, the least dishonorable option available. They had lost the war. That was inevitable. But they could choose the manner of their defeat, and they chose the American general whose legend had outgrown his actual command. German memoirs published in the decades after the war reinforced this narrative. General Erich von Manstein, in his post-war writings, noted that by April 1945, Wehrmacht commanders universally preferred Western captivity. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who commanded in Italy and later in the West, acknowledged the strategic collapse that made surrender inevitable, and the clear preference among his subordinates for American custody. Even lower-ranking officers, writing personal accounts, mentioned Patton by name as the preferred captor. The consistency is remarkable. Across ranks, across units, across the fractured remnants of the Wehrmacht, the calculation was identical. War is fought with steel and fire, but it is won with perception. In the spring of 1945, as Nazi Germany collapsed, the mechanics of surrender revealed something fundamental about human nature under extreme duress. Men facing annihilation made rational choices based not on ideology or patriotism, but on the simple mathematics of survival. They chose captors who might let them live over those who might not. They chose predictability over chaos. And they chose a legend, George S. Patton, not because they admired him, but because his reputation promised something increasingly rare, rules in a world that had abandoned them. The phrase, "Sir, the Germans are surrendering to you," captures this strange moment when a commander's mythology became a tangible asset, when reputation itself functioned as a weapon that ended battles before they began. Patton spent his life cultivating an image designed to intimidate enemies and inspire his own troops. In the war's final act, that image achieved something he never intended. It became a beacon for defeated men seeking the least terrible fate. They fled toward him not in defeat's desperation, but in its calculated acceptance. And in doing so, they revealed warfare's uncomfortable truth, that even in humanity's darkest hours, the distance between enemy and captor can narrow to a single question. Will you let me live? Patton, for all his fury and flaws, answered yes.